The Princes in the Tower. When Richard III died at the Battle of Bosworth Field, he left a mystery behind him. Remember, at first Richard wasn't king. He was the regent for his nephew, Edward V. But then Edward V and his little brother disappeared. What happened to these two boys? No one knew. Here is the story of the two princes in the Tower. When Edward IV married Elizabeth Woodville, the woman his family didn't like, they had two sons. The elder boy was named Edward, after his father. The younger boy was named Richard, after his uncle. The younger boy lived with his mother, the Queen, in London, but little Edward lived in a quiet castle out in the country, with servants and tutors to look after him. One of the Queen's brothers lived with him as his governor. He made sure that Edward finished all his schoolwork and did as he was told. When Edward IV died, his elder son was only 12. Someone needed to help him rule England until he was old enough to be king on his own. Edward had left papers making his brother Richard the protector, or substitute king, for the little boy. But young Edward's mother and her brothers wanted to be the ones who helped the new king rule. So they didn't tell Richard, who was far away in the north of England, that Edward IV was dead. Instead, they planned to bring the little boy to London and have him crowned right away. Once young Edward was crowned king, he could choose his own helpers. But one of Richard's friends saw what was happening and sent Richard a frantic message. "Hasten to the capital with a strong force," he wrote. "Avenge the insult done by your enemies. You should take the young king immediately under your protection." As soon as Richard got this message, he set off for London himself with a band of soldiers. He met Edward, his servants, and his governor on their way to London for the young king's crowning. When Richard saw Edward, he knelt down and bowed his head, but he also told his nephew, "Your mother and her brothers are trying to take over your kingdom. And if you allow them to rule for you, they might try to get rid of you. I fear for your life." Edward insisted, "My mother and her brothers are innocent of any wrongdoing." But Richard and his soldiers disagreed. They locked Edward's governor in a nearby inn and arrested Edward's servants and soldiers. Then Richard put all his own soldiers in their place, and Richard sent a message to Edward's mother and her brothers saying, "I haven't kidnapped the king, my nephew. I have rescued him. I am more worried about his welfare than any of you. I will bring him to London very shortly so that he can be crowned." The Queen and her brothers didn't believe Richard. They were sure that Richard would kill Edward and take the crown. But most people in London trusted Richard and refused to join the Queen in fighting against him. So the Queen took her younger son, Edward's little brother, and hid in a church where she would be safe. Meanwhile, Richard did just what he said he would do. He brought young Edward, now King Edward V, to London and rode with him through the streets while people cheered. "Long live the king!" He made all the important people of London swear allegiance to Edward V. But he still wouldn't allow the Queen or her brothers to see Edward, and soon he suggested that Edward would be safer if he moved to the Tower of London. The Tower had been built hundreds of years before by William the Conqueror, as a jail. Since then, other kings had added walls and buildings to the Tower, so that it was a palace as well as a jail. Edward had his own apartment in the Tower, with his own servants and his own soldiers. But all of his servants and soldiers were chosen by Richard. Next, Richard sent a whole band of armed men to the church where the Queen was staying. He ordered the Queen to send Edward's little brother to the Tower of London to live with Edward. "Edward is lonely," the message said. "He has no one to play with." The Queen didn't want to send her youngest son to stay at the Tower. Then Richard would have control over both of the heirs to the throne. But with all of those armed men surrounding her, she had no choice. So she sent the little boy out to his uncle, and Richard took his nephew to live in the Tower with his brother Edward. The next day, Richard announced that Edward's coronation, the ceremony in which he would be crowned king, would be put off until later. A few days later, a famous priest preached a sermon saying that Richard, not Edward, should be king, and a few days after that, a group of noblemen gathered together and asked Richard to take the crown away from Edward for the good of England. Many people suspected that Richard had ordered the priest and the noblemen to say these things. The people who had loved him as a protector, one London man wrote in his journal, started to complain about him when he made himself king. But most people didn't complain very loudly, especially after Richard ordered Edward's governor beheaded. No one wanted to be next. Just a few weeks later, Richard rode to the Tower of London himself for his own coronation. His supporters crowned him king. Now Richard, the king's uncle, was Richard III, King of England. But what about Edward and his younger brother? They were still living in the Tower, but fewer and fewer people were allowed to see them. Soon the people of London began to mutter that the princes had been killed. The rumor spread through England and even over to France. But for the next 2 years, no one knew for sure where the princes were or what had happened to them. Then Henry Tudor invaded England, killed Richard at the Battle of Bosworth, and became king. When Henry arrived in London, he had the Tower searched, but there was no sign of the boys. No one ever discovered what happened to the princes. 25 years later, one of Richard's knights claimed that he had murdered the 2 boys, but he confessed to avoid being tortured, so he might have made this story up. 2 important historians then wrote that Richard had ordered the boys killed, but both of those historians wanted to please Henry VII, who had replaced Richard on the throne, so they were anxious to make Richard look as bad as possible. Other historians later suggest that Henry VII did away with the boys when he had the Tower searched, so that he would have no trouble keeping his throne. Almost 200 years later, workers were clearing away a clutter of old buildings in the Tower of London when they found an old chest, buried in the ground. When they opened the chest, they found 2 skeletons. Almost everyone agreed that these 2 skeletons were those of the princes, but who killed them? We'll never know for sure, but one thing is certain. In the late Middle Ages, being the heir to the throne was dangerous.